You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Today at T-Mobile, I'm joined by a special co-anchor.
What up, everybody? It's your boy, Big Snoop Double G.
Snoop, where can people go to find great deals?
Head to T-Mobile.com and get 4 iPhone 16s with Apple Intelligence on us, plus 4 lines for $25.
That's quite a deal, Snoop. And when you switch to T-Mobile, you can save versus the other big guys' comparable plans plus streaming.
Respect. We up out of here.
See how you can save on wireless and streaming versus the other big guys at T-Mobile.com/switch. Apple Intelligence requires iOS 18.1 or later.
This episode is brought to you by Prime Video. In the small town of Holland, Michigan, nothing is ever what it seems. Behind the tulip festivals and pretty houses lay dark secrets that threaten to tear a marriage apart. Nicole Kidman stars in this darkly twisted thriller about a wife and mother whose quest to uncover her husband's secrets may get her more than she bargained for. Holland, streaming on Prime Video March 27th.
Hello everyone and welcome to another History of the Second World War summary episode. As a reminder, these summary episodes are built around the concept that there have been a lot of episodes of this podcast, and that sometimes there's important information from episodes released years ago that I think would be good to give everybody a reminder on. This time we're going back to look at the Interwar Airpower episodes, which released back in 2022, about 3 years ago. The series looked at the evolution of air power theory during the interwar years, the impact that the experiences of the First World War had on that theory, and how those theories were turned into reality by the European air forces in the years before the start of the Second World War. The best place to start this episode is to clearly state that, in reality, up until, let's say, 1936 and the start of the Spanish Civil War, nobody really knew what was or was not an effective air power doctrine. Theorists all over the world could look back at what had happened during the First World War, but as the years went by throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, the lack of a major conflict meant that the experiences of 1918 became less and less relevant due to the constant changes and advancements in technology. The fighters, bombers, and other aircraft that were equipping squadrons in 1939 with their large engines, single wings, their all-metal designs, bore little resemblance to the much slower biplanes that had been the norm over the battlefields in 1918. This meant that in many instances, they got things wrong and made incorrect assumptions, and often when that occurred, it was multiple different nations making the same mistakes. This ranged from a lack of emphasis placed on air-to-ground coordination all the way up to just an absolutely fundamental misunderstanding of what would be required to stage a successful strategic bombing campaign. These theoretical miscues then led into bad design for aircraft that sometimes were designed based on the nation's air power leaders sort of believing what a war would be like, but then it actually wasn't. And when those beliefs were incorrect, the resulting aircraft would be incorrect as well. It made things look a little silly sometimes. To complicate things further, sometimes the design was not even bad, but instead simply overtaken by new aircraft introduced by the enemy that made the entire earlier concept obsolete. The best example of this would be the variety of light bombers introduced before the war that planned to use their speed as their protection at a time when the fastest military aircraft in the world were dual-engined, and nobody had really any early warning radar, so it was impossible to vector interceptors onto those two-engine light bombers. These same bombers would be very vulnerable when both of those facts were changed due to a new generation of mono-engine fighters and the introduction of radar. The final topic to mention before we get into the episode is that everything was a moving target when it came to how to use air power, the aircraft involved, and the capabilities of the enemy. Especially during the late 1930s, the overall situation in an air war drastically swung in various directions. A good example of this is that for much of the 1930s, the Italian Regia Aeronautica was actually considered to be the strongest air force in the world before it was overtaken by the German Luftwaffe in the late 1930s. And if the war had been delayed another few years, it's likely that the French and British would have been in a better position than the Germans. It was all based on when they planned to invest in their air forces, what they were investing in, and how they planned to use them, all of which were complicated by incorrect beliefs about what air power was and was not capable of, and industrial capabilities of each nation. Because I'm me, we're going to start by talking about the First World War for just a moment. Much like what would happen during the Second World War, there would be a tremendous amount of evolution in air power during the First World War. All of the armies involved in 1914 had some kind of airplanes, but they were very flimsy machines made out of wood and canvas, and more importantly, they were not designed for combat in any way. They were instead a scouting and reconnaissance platform, with the most important weapon that they contained being the eyes of the pilot and the observer. From these humble beginnings, the air forces of Europe would rapidly evolve, introducing first weapons, then specialized pursuit aircraft, and then even the first strategic bombers. By the end of the war, there were a wide variety of combat aircraft that were designed for most of the specialized roles that exist in sort of air combat today. Fighters, bombers, close air support, reconnaissance, and transportation were all represented in the designs. Beyond the improvements in design and manufacturing, there were also important technological changes that would be introduced. Interrupter gears that allowed pilots to fire their machine guns through their propellers, various wing configurations for different tasks, new building materials, and perhaps most important for the future, the introduction and widespread adoption of the radio. The ability to put radios into aircraft, which would be mainly a late war development, would be a crucial moment for the future of air power. Before it was introduced, once an airplane took off from its airfield, it was entirely on its own. It could not effectively be communicated with, or it could not also communicate with the ground. To emphasize this a bit, during early attempts to use spotter aircraft for artillery spotting, the best way that could be determined to communicate back to the ground was for the aircraft to literally write down notes on some paper and fly over the artillery battery and drop those notes in a canvas bag. That's the best that they could do. Radio changed all of this, and the ability to communicate in real time made some things much easier, like artillery spotting, and also introduced entirely new possibilities, with close air support being a good example of a mission that greatly benefited from the pilot in the aircraft being able to receive up-to-date information from the ground. All of these improvements and innovations during the First World War made one thing clear: air power was an important part of future conflict, and it was critical that all military powers around the world were able to project air power over the battlefield and against their enemies. No topic would occupy as much mental capacity or be subject to as much theory crafting during the interwar years as the topic of strategic bombing. During the First World War, there had been dedicated bombers that had been produced, and there were even bombers that could be classified as strategic heavy bombers, like the Russian-built Sikorsky Ilya Muromets, which had 4 engines and a range of 500 kilometers. German Zeppelins also took bombing to new levels of range through their aerial bombing campaigns against both Britain and France. The efforts of these bombers and the large number of tactical bombing raids done during the war would seem to point to a new way to prosecute a conflict. During the 1920s, this idea would be taken much further by air power theorists all over the world. First among them in theory and in impact for the future of strategic bombing anyway, was the Italian Julio Douhet. Douhet would write, among other things, The Command of the War, which was widely read during the 1920s and also aligned with the thoughts of many air power theorists in other nations. Douhet's work contained 3 key assumptions that would be critical to the formulation of strategic bombing during the 1920s and 1930s. The first of these would be that there was very little that could be done to defend against long-range strategic bombing. Douhet discounted the impact of both airborne interception by fighters and the possibility of destroying bombers through ground-based anti-aircraft fire. In both cases, when Douhet was writing in the early 1920s, he was pretty correct. Without any kind of early warning radar, and with the slow climb rate possessed by fighters during those years, intercepting bombers was an incredibly difficult proposition. This was especially true if there were several bombers all coming in from different directions, which Douhet would advocate for. This was the root of the famous statement that the bomber will always get through, which was said by the British politician Stanley Baldwin in 1932. Even over a decade after Douhet wrote his famous work, it was still not a bad assumption, because while fighters had grown in capability, bombers could fly higher and faster than ever before. It was a challenge that the fighters would not be able to rise to, really until just a few years before the start of the war, and even there, they needed help. The second key assumption that Douhet made was that civilian populations were very vulnerable to the effects of strategic bombing. Up until the advent of the airplane, warfare did not really reach far beyond the front lines. If you were a civilian and you were more than, say, 50 kilometers from the armies involved, there was no real way that the war could really impact you. Strategic bombing completely changed this, and suddenly there were huge new concerns about the impact that bombing would have on civilian morale. Key to this fear was the idea of a bolt-from-the-blue style of attack, where enemy bombers just appeared over major cities and started dropping bombs with no warning. The concern was that this would cause civilian morale to collapse instantaneously, causing a public outcry for peace. This would prove to be completely inaccurate during the Second World War, and in fact the resiliency and bravery that civilian populations all over Europe met bombing with was incredible. Not only did it not cause a collapse of civilian morale, but at times it would bolster the will to resist among the people being bombed. This was the case even though Duhay's third assumption would prove to also be mostly incorrect, which was that the bombers of the 1920s and 1930s had the capability to actually hit things and that they would be able to deliver a sufficient number of bombs to actually knock a nation out of a war. When it came to hitting things with the bombs, the general assumptions about the accuracy of bombing were based around estimations and tests for how many bombs could be placed within a certain radius of a target, and then that was multiplied by the estimated impact based on the study of bombs during the First World War. The challenge was that there was an underestimation of how much harder it would be to hit anything with bombs as bombers became faster and started flying at higher altitudes. And also, I guess, we're also being shot at by more and more types of anti-aircraft guns and other fighter aircraft. As experiences during the Second World War would prove, hitting things with strategic bombers was actually incredibly hard, even getting within hundreds of meters of the target. It was hard. But for many air power theorists during the interwar years, they were also assuming a level of accuracy that would not be truly possible really until the advent of maybe guided bombs 50 years later. All of these assumptions meant that strategic bombing advocates greatly overestimated the impact that bombing would have on the enemy. For those advocates, strategic bombing was the only thing that mattered and could win the war by itself. The logical next step from that assumption was that the only thing that nations should spend money on were more and more strategic bombers, which was the root of the arguments in every nation as the debates raged about how the air forces should spend the money available to them. While the theory of strategic bombing basically became a sacred theory, not to be assailed in any instance, both advocates and critics of strategic bombing theory had to deal with the fact that technology was advancing very quickly. From 1921 to the start of the Second World War, the top speed of aircraft almost doubled, with the airspeed record in 1921 being 330 kilometers per hour, and then a Bf-109 reaching a top speed, not combat loaded, but a top speed of 611 kilometers per hour in the late 1930s. While speed was the most obvious change in capabilities, one that was just as important was the rise in service ceiling, with greater altitude being an important aspect of aerial combat at times when there was a significant speed advantage that could be gained by diving on an enemy, so you wanted to get as high as possible before entering combat. Both an increase in speed and altitude made bombing more difficult because it was simply harder to hit things on the ground that were further away, and that's pretty simple to understand. But it brought significant advantages in terms of safety as long as the aircraft was the fastest available. The problem was trying to be the fastest and stay the fastest over time. This was because of the somewhat frantic pace of developments in military aviation, particularly in the 1930s, as all the nations around Europe began their own rearmament campaigns. During the mid-1930s, each generation of aircraft brought with it a jump in performance and capabilities that made it more and more difficult for older models to fulfill their missions. A state-of-the-art fighter might be leapfrogged by an enemy design just years after it was unveiled, making the investment in design and manufacturing look like a mistake in retrospect. Fighter development had a particularly potent impact on other types of aircraft due to the fact that the speed of fighters increased so much during this time, with many of the assumptions around strategic bombing and also tactical bombing being that they could outrun enemy fighters. When that was no longer the case, the vulnerability of the bombers became a major problem. This would become very apparent as early as the Spanish Civil War, when German bombers were intercepted by Soviet fighter planes for the first time, and it would be a lesson learned at ever greater cost by every air force that launched bombing campaigns during the war. One of the ways to try and solve this problem, and the path that would be chosen particularly by the Americans and the British, would be making the bombers slower but far more heavily armed, with the peak examples of this being things like the B-17 or the Avro Lancaster. Divorcing themselves of any belief that they could outrun the enemy, they instead just threw a bunch of heavy machine guns and men to fire them on board the bombers in the hopes that this would be able to protect the bombers from the enemy, and the results were somewhat dubious. The final technological innovation to discuss from before the war was the introduction and then proliferation of radar. The impact of radar on the overall course of the air war cannot be overstated, and it would be as impactful as radio had been during the First World War. It helped to solve the greatest problem when it came to reacting to an enemy attack, knowing when it was going to happen and where it was coming from. This had been such a problem before the introduction of radar because of the length of time that it took an aircraft to go from being on the ground to reaching the appropriate altitude to intercept an enemy formation. This time continued to increase as planes were flying higher and higher, and also they were going faster so they could cover more ground before the enemy fighters could meet them. It was the general lack of information that made bomber interception seem impossible, until there was a machine that could tell you if an enemy was coming and at least the very basic information about their altitude and direction. By 1939, all of the major powers were either hard at work on radar or had at least basic examples of the technology in use, with the British Chain Home system being by far the most famous radar system at the time. I mean, you might make a case that it's the most famous radar system ever. Radar would see a huge amount of evolution during the war, but even at the earliest stages, it was able to answer the basic questions that needed to be answered, to the great effect of all of the air forces that used them, and whether that effect was good or bad depending on which side of the radar signal you were on. Now, there are a huge number of other technologies that could be discussed here, but this is just a summary episode, so the best you're going to get is a quick hitter list of some of them here. Retractable landing gear, proximity-fused anti-aircraft munitions, variable pitch propellers, engine capacity and power, navigation system, airborne cameras, and many, many, many others.
Are your ulcerative colitis symptoms proving difficult to manage? Tremfya guselkumab can help you manage the cycle of UC symptoms. At 1 year, many patients taking Tremfya achieved clinical remission, and some patients also achieved endoscopic remission. Individual results may vary. Tremfya is a prescription medicine used to treat adults with moderately to severely active ulcerative colitis. Serious allergic reactions and increased risk of infections may occur. Before treatment, your doctor should check you for infections and TB. Tell your doctor if you have an infection, flu-like symptoms, or if you need a vaccine. Ask your doctor if Tremfya can help you manage the cycle of UC symptoms. Call 1-800-526-7736 to learn more or visit tremfyaradio.com.
You've maxed out your 401k, you're contributing to an IRA, and making some other investments. You're ahead of the game and doing well. But where do you go from here? The same old story can only get you so far. If you want a new take from a new type of financial professional, we invite you to get a fresh perspective beside an agent with the backing of New York Life. Insurance, investments, retirement, and more. Visit nyl.com to learn more. Investments are offered through registered representatives of NYLife Securities, LLC, member FINRA SIPC, a New York Life company.
When the war started in 1939, every air force around Europe was in a different state of readiness and preparation to participate in a conflict. There were three primary ways to judge whether or not an air force was prepared. Did they have the right aircraft? Did they have enough of those aircraft? And did they have pilots to fly those aircraft? Using these questions to judge the various air forces, they can be broadly categorized into a few different groups. The first group were those that were not really prepared for a war, even though they were about to be in one. One of the nations on this list was Poland. The problem for the Poles was and always would be a problem of numbers. Some of the aircraft that they were flying were actually quite capable of airborne victories, like the P-11C fighter, which had some areas where it was actually stronger than the Bf-109, like in maneuverability. It also had one of the newest bombers in the world with the PZL-37, which was just as capable as any other bomber in service at the time that the war started. But there would simply never be enough of these aircraft to match up with the Germans, and at some point the Polish pilots, even those that were highly skilled, simply could not trade at a high enough exchange rate to prevent the Polish squadrons from being attrited into nothing. It did not help that things were going quite poorly on the ground for the Polish military, which forced the Polish Air Force to constantly displace from one airfield to the next, which just made everything more difficult. The next Air Force that would probably fall into the unprepared category was the French Air Force. The French had entered the First World War with one of the most powerful air forces in the world, and during that conflict they had been innovators. But then during the interwar years, due to a lack of investment in aviation manufacturing and military aircraft in general, they would never be able to match their enemies in terms of the number or quality of aircraft. They certainly tried, though, and after the French rearmament started in 1936, there would be many efforts to reform the aviation industry in France through both private means and by nationalizing poorly performing factories. There were also many efforts to purchase aircraft from the United States, efforts that would prove, in both cases, to be too little and too late to match up to the Luftwaffe when the war started. The next category of air forces are ones that I would refer to as being in an awkward spot, or a weird space. And it's a space that is occupied by both the Italian Regia Aeronautica and the Soviet Red Air Force. But they're sort of in this zone for two different reasons. Starting with the Soviets, unlike some of the other nations, their problem was never in the number of aircraft that they had in their air force. And in fact, in 1938, the Red Air Force was the largest in the world. The challenge instead was the quality of the aircraft and the quality of the ability of the Soviet military to use them. The Soviets had put a lot of effort and resources into building bombers and fighters using designs from the mid-1930s, many of which would be outpaced by the German designs that they would face during the war. There would be another generation of aircraft introduced between 1939 and 1941, and the Soviet industry would produce a lot of them, with over 10,000 aircraft built in both 1939 and 1940. But the greatest problem for the Red Air Force was properly utilizing all of the aircraft that they had, with not enough resources being dedicated to ground crew, facilities, and pilot training. This made it difficult to actually utilize the amount of aircraft that were available and getting them where they needed to be and using them how they needed to be used at the right time was a major challenge for the Soviets once the war started. The Italians would experience a very different problem in the years before the war. During the early and mid-1930s, the Italian aviation industry was one of the world's best, with Italian manufacturers holding things like the world's speed records in many instances. Italian manufacturers would also win several endurance awards during the early and mid-1930s, and the combination of speed and endurance in various aircraft would be used by Mussolini's regime to build out a very capable air force that was an important factor when other nations considered the risk of a possible war with Italy. The aircraft available would then be used in Ethiopia and then the Spanish Civil War, where they would distinguish themselves quite well. However, it was because they were embroiled in these two conflicts that the Italians would begin to have some problems. The first problem was that being involved in both wars drained the Italian military budget at a time when other nations were rapidly expanding their military rearmament and their military industries. This made it difficult to properly fund maintenance and replacement efforts during the late 1930s. The second problem was that Italian manufacturers, while some of the best in terms of technical capabilities, would prove far less adept at expanding their productions to the capacity required. And they would also begin to struggle with their ability to innovate and to keep pace with other nations. This meant that the all-important next generation of aircraft that were introduced in the late 1930s to match up to the latest examples from other nations would never be produced in sufficient quantities before or after Italy's entry into the war in 1940. The third group of air forces were probably the most prepared, and we'll start here with the Royal Air Force. Because when it entered into the war, it had some of the same problems as the French and the Polish. They had started to seriously invest in rearmament later than their German enemies, and even then there were limits to how much the British were willing to spend to build out the RAF in the short term. However, their ability to ramp up production outpaced even the Germans, with the two nations producing roughly similar numbers of aircraft during 1939. The problem for the British is that their production numbers for earlier years lagged far behind the German production figures. Along with the ability to produce a larger number of aircraft, though, or at least to scale their aircraft production, the British would also have some challenges, and they would also make some mistakes. The first of these mistakes was the belief among Bomber Command that the RAF was capable of launching a strategic bombing campaign against Germany in the late 1930s. This is an area where we have to put aside what the RAF would become and the incredible volume of munitions that they would drop on Germany later during the Second World War. Because at the beginning of the conflict, the RAF did not have the technology, the aircraft, or the tactics in place to launch almost any kind of bombing campaign. let alone a strategic bombing campaign to knock Germany out of the war. For example, when it came to strategic bombing, the navigational equipment was simply not available to make sure the planes could actually find their targets, and the bombers that they didn't have the bombing capacity to actually drop enough bombs. Even from a tactical bombing perspective, Bomber Command would find itself unable to drop the required bombs where it wanted to, when it needed to be dropped, and actually hit things. This would be demonstrated in France during operations like the attempts to bomb the bridges across the Meuse to prevent the German crossing of the river. Now, Bomber Command would eventually find their footing, and a new generation of British bombers would be able to change their fortunes later in the war, with the ability of the British to build out their new bombing force a testament to the British aviation industry. That same industry would be important during the Battle of Britain as well in 1940, with the investments in the aviation industry paying off at the most critical of moments. Along with their ability to build enough aircraft, the British would also benefit from some really good design choices before the war, with the most famous being the Spitfire, but that just being one of many. They would also have a technological advantage when it came to radar, with the chain home system, which was first put in place in 1938. The radar could not shoot down German aircraft, but it greatly reduced the advantage that the Germans enjoyed in other theaters due to the number of aircraft in the Luftwaffe. It acted for the British like a force multiplier, allowing them to use their numbers as wisely as possible, something that other air forces that faced the Luftwaffe in the early war were unable to do. And this made it also more difficult for the Luftwaffe to kind of overwhelm the British by simply concentrating their forces at a specific point and overwhelming any British fighters in that area. The British could bring a lot of numbers as well because they could sort of know in advance where the Germans were flying and when they were going to be there. This, of course, leaves us with the Luftwaffe. When the Germans started the war, the Luftwaffe had a few key advantages over other air forces that it would face in the opening months of the Second World War. The first advantage is that the German rearmament efforts had really gotten started before those of their enemies, and they had pursued them with a bit more vigor. There were many problems for the German economy due to the rearmament campaign, and the Allied efforts would eventually eclipse what the Germans were capable of. But for the years in the mid-1930s, the Germans were far ahead. The numerical advantage built up during the pre-war years would then still be present in September 1939, allowing the Germans to enter the war roughly at parity in terms of modern combat aircraft with their three largest enemies combined, that being the Polish, the French, and the British. However, the Germans would enjoy a much better position when it came to the air war, due at least partially to geography and the decisions made by the British and French all the way up to the fall of France. Basically, the Germans would be allowed to defeat their enemies in detail, the Poles, and then the French, and then they would attack the British, although at that point it wouldn't quite go so well. One of the reasons that they would experience so many challenges over Britain was due to the specific makeup of the Luftwaffe. It was an air force that was built first and foremost to support the army on the ground, with light and medium bombers designed to hit targets relatively close to the fighting, like railways and troop concentrations. It wasn't one prepared to launch a true strategic bombing campaign. They also, of course, had the premier dive bomber of the European theater during the early war years with the Ju-87 Stuka, which had been introduced in 1936, which gave the Germans plenty of time to produce them in quantity. Along with the Stuka, the Bf-109 was probably the most famous German aircraft from the war, being introduced in early 1937. This was a really important factor for the overall course of the air war, because it was early enough that the Germans could build the Bf-109s and other aircraft in sufficient quantity to meet their needs, even given their material shortages. But it was late enough that they were actually still good when the war started, which is where the Italians, for example, kind of fell down. It was helpful that the Germans kind of had a solid run of designs with aircraft like the Stuka, the Bf-109, their bombers like the He-111. All of these aircraft would quickly begin to show their age after the war started, but it allowed them to enter the war at kind of the top of their game, mostly. Now, one of the criticisms that would be leveled at the Luftwaffe after the war would be the lack of investment made into a true heavy strategic bomber, something with 4 engines, long range, and a large bombing capacity. These were not really necessary for most of the early war campaigns that the Germans planned to fight, but the lack of focus on such a design, especially after the death of Walther Wever in 1936, is an area of criticism. Wever was a strong advocate for a heavy bomber project, and with his early death, there was no longer a strong voice within the Luftwaffe for such projects because they were expensive. They also put a major strain on the German ability to produce aircraft engines, which for most countries in the late 1930s was kind of the limiting factor when it came to building aircraft, because of course the engines are kind of the most complex piece of the machine, and so you were often limited by how many engines you could produce. Now, while they would not have a heavy bomber project anywhere near completion in 1939, the Germans would have one more major advantage that they would enter the war with, and that would be experience. During the Spanish Civil War, the Luftwaffe would send the Condor Legion to Spain, where they would gain valuable experiences in essentially all aspects of air warfare. All of these advantages, along with the focus on cooperation with the German ground forces, would make the Luftwaffe the best air force at close air support during the early war years, which when combined with the ability to interdict enemy air forces through the use of the Bf-109, would put them in a good place during the war's early campaigns. Now there would be challenges, huge challenges, insurmountable challenges later in the war, but in 1939 and in 1940, those challenges would be in the future.